Jacques, will you take us away?
Thanks, Kenny. And I just want to reiterate what Kenny said, which is thank you so much for joining us for this exciting conversation. We are going to be talking about a really cool subject, which is how do we get infill right in Tacoma? And for those of you that weren't able to join us for sessions 1 and 2, I just want to remind you that the virtual cafe number 1 was about the housing crisis itself. So we talked about what data do we have, how do we know that the housing crisis is happening, who is impacted by the housing crisis, and what we came away with in that conversation was, the housing crisis is very big. It has a scope that's really large, and it's not just affecting people that are in poverty or that you would consider to be folks that need affordable housing. It has impacts across the economic spectrum and across all income levels. The second session of the Cafe Series was about what role the city can take in addressing that housing crisis. And for those of you that were able to make it, you probably recall that we talked about things like the zoning changes that we're going to continue to talk about today as one avenue that the city can take to address the housing crisis, and other things such as affordable housing incentives, adding or focusing on development in certain areas of town to increase opportunity for underinvested neighborhoods, and several other potential avenues. And today, really excited again that we're gonna take the next step in this conversation and talk about how do we actually get housing growth right for Tacoma. So what we are focusing this conversation around is the Home in Tacoma project. And the Home in Tacoma project is about creating housing actions to meet multiple goals that you can see here on your screen. Creating an inclusive, livable, sustainable, and prosperous city, planning and preparing for growth, prioritizing equity, empowerment, and anti-racism, balancing housing and other goals, and building on what's special about Tacoma's neighborhoods. And I'd really like to just call your attention to the 2nd and 5th bullet points here, because I think they're going to be particularly important to our conversation today, which is planning and preparing for growth. And I'll just quickly say, our region is one of the fastest growing regions in the country. So growth is not necessarily an option at this point. We know that we are growing. So planning and preparing for that growth is an essential part of our housing strategy. The 5th bullet point says building on what's special about Tacoma's neighborhoods. And I think that relates to really what we're going to be talking about today, which is how do we get that growth right? How do we make sure that that growth works for everybody? So Tacoma's land use framework is what we have for our housing growth strategy. And it really gives us space for, or plans for how to use the city in terms of providing space for business, industry, parks, and open space, and of course, housing. And you can see here in this image that each of these different colors corresponds with a different zoning type in our land use framework, whether it be a mixed use center where you'd see more businesses and economic activity, to the focus of our conversation, which is this light yellow color that you see across 75% of Tacoma's land area, which is currently designated as just single family residential, which means that you can only build a standalone detached house. And this is just another version of that image where you can see that 75% of single family residential zoned land. And right now that means that there is not diverse housing types in those neighborhoods unless they were put there before these zoning changes were made in the 1950s. So about 3/4 of Tacoma's housing land supply is set aside for these single family detached housing. which means that we have limits in what kind of housing supply choice and affordability we can provide for Tacoma's residents of today and our prospective residents of tomorrow. And what we're going to be talking about in large part is how missing middle housing can fit in with the scale of single family housing. So when we talk about getting growth right, how do we use missing middle housing in these areas that are currently designated as single family zoned to fit in with that scale in a way that's appropriate and feels like we are building on what makes those neighborhoods great today. And for those of you that are not familiar with this missing middle housing type that I'm talking about, missing middle is all of the housing types that are in between the detached single family houses that, that I just talked about and what you think of as kind of the larger apartment complexes. But there are all these potential housing choices in between those. And you can see here, they include duplexes, townhouses, courtyard buildings. And this is a really cool image to help show and illustrate what that missing middle housing types are. And here's another image that I think makes it a little bit easier for us to see what those housing types actually look like in real life. So here you can see what on the top left a single family house looks like, and ADUs are actually one of the housing types that provide infill that are already on the books in terms of passed in Tacoma. But these other housing types you can see here are duplex, triplex, cottage housing, fourplexes, small lot, single family houses, townhouses. All of these are different versions of what missing middle housing can look like. And then the one other change that we're talking about is that on our transit corridors, and those are our areas where we have a lot of transportation opportunities. So you can think of, well-used bus lines, other public transit options where people can get to work or other activities easily. There is the potential for having medium scale housing that's walkable to that transit. So medium scale buildings can serve as a transition point from some of the larger housing options to the lower scale residential options that we're talking about when we talk about missing middle housing. So for those of you that want to learn more and get involved, I would just point you to this website that you see on the bottom right. If you go to cityoftacoma.org/home in Tacoma, you'll see a lot more information, including the Housing Choices Survey, which is, I believe, going to close next week. So if you have interest in providing more feedback after today, please go ahead and fill that survey out and learn more about the project. But to give you a quick snapshot of where we're going, we have been working towards setting up community and stakeholder engagement, such as this cafe series and public review of draft comprehensive plan changes that will lead into planning commission recommendations that will be going forth to council in the coming months. And city council will then review and take action sometime between April and June. And then depending on the action that city council takes on those recommendations, July to December will be around developing zoning and standards to match those recommendations. So really there's going to be a lot of movement potentially in the coming year, which is why we're having this important conversation and reaching out for all of your input as we seek to make Tacoma's housing options work for everyone. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to introduce our three fantastic speakers for today. And I'd like to start by thanking them. So thank you, Leslie, Kyle, and Katie for joining us today. Katie Chintis is a founding partner at WC Studio, an adventurous architecture practice that specializes in the design of exciting and resource-efficient building projects. In addition to guiding clients through the design and building process, Katie has acted as the architect developer of 2 missing middle housing projects in Tacoma. Katie, I'm really interested to hear about the experiences that you've had with those projects. And just as a side note, Katie enjoys working on small and medium multifamily and mixed use projects because they represent a development sweet spot at the intersection of sustainability, affordability, and vibrant neighborhoods. Kyle Price came to Tacoma in 1999 and was impressed with the city's optimism, grit, and potential. And since then, he's seen many great developments that have enhanced the life of the city, including the building of UWT, the growth of the restaurant and brewery scene, the expansion of the zoo, the revitalization of the waterfront, redevelopment of historic buildings, blossoming of farmers markets, and really so much more. To be involved in the growth and improvement of the city and its neighborhoods, Kyle joined the North Slope Historic District Board and then the North End Neighborhood Council Board. He served for the last several years as the chair of the North End Neighborhood Council, where he's been involved with a number of issues related to zoning and planning. Really excited to hear from Kyle about some of the things that he's experienced and seen in his work in the city as well. So welcome to you as well, Kyle. And then finally, Leslie Young. Leslie has a BA in Urban Studies and a minor in Law and Policy, which is key because her work is very much at the intersection of those two worlds. She has a professional certificate in commercial real estate and does a lot of work on the real estate side here in Tacoma. She's a community development consultant and has been doing residential real estate for 16 plus years. So Leslie has a ton of experience with the market and what housing choice looks like. And then finally, Leslie is a Lincoln District advocate and community member since 2002. So she brings us that perspective from the Lincoln District and the South End. So Leslie, welcome. Thank you for being here with us. So thank you three for joining us today and having this conversation. I want to jump right into it with the three of you and talk about really the central question today, which is what are the important issues for the city to consider as we think about how to get infill right? And Katie, I'd love to start with you. And Katie, you're on mute if you are talking right now. Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, just to get right into it, I'm going to go big on this answer and say that the most critical issues we face are climate change and livability. And livability is broad. It means different things to different people, but I think there's a lot of overlap in these two issues. And as we work to solve one, we can make progress on the other at the same time. And I think also there will be some consensus that the right infill strategy will make our neighborhoods safer, healthier, more affordable, and more fun to live in. So we can do that while reducing Tacoma's carbon emissions at the same time, even as our population increases. And this will be a multi-pronged effort that includes access to transit, healthy food, economic opportunities, and healthcare as well. But inclusive neighborhoods with more housing choice are a really important part to this holistic plan for sustainable growth, affordable homes, and just the overall well-being of people in Tacoma, whether you're here now, have been here 30 years, or are going to be here in the next 30 years.
Thank you, Katie. I feel like there's so much more to dive into there in those little tidbits you gave me. So I'm looking forward to you building off of that in the rest of our conversation. Kyle, I want to turn to you and ask you the same question though. What do you think are the most important issues as we seek to get housing growth right and infill right here in Tacoma?
Well, first of all, Jacques, Kenny, thanks for doing all the good moderation for these sessions. If you're visiting in the participants and you haven't watched the others, they're great. You should go watch them. And thanks, Elliot, who's watching it. Thanks for inviting me to be part of the panel. I would say my answer is much more grainy, maybe just like a little nitty gritty kind of stuff. I think the big issue for me is design. I don't think people are opposed to having denser neighborhoods, but I think nothing really upsets neighbors more than having a problematic, ugly building just plunked down into the middle of the neighborhood, because it tends to rip away at the fabric of a neighborhood that might have already been running fairly successfully to begin with. So, and I think, and when I say design, I think people might think of like Leavenworth, but we're not. I mean, we're not turning Tacoma into a little Bavaria or anything like that. I mean, design is actually a lot of different things. Right, it could involve heights. I mean, not having things that are so disproportionate high next to things that are shorter, or it could involve how parking is managed, or even occasionally it could be setbacks or requirements of green space, or and really another one that's important that people don't think about maybe is the orientation of housing projects to the rest of the neighborhood. A really great example is with the North Slope Historic District. If you've never, it's one of the largest residential historic districts in the United States. And one of the reasons it became a historic district, because there was demolition of these beautiful historic single family houses, and they were being demolished. And then some of them were being replaced with these fairly ugly developments that just housed a lot of people. But the developments were not designed in any way that made them interact with the neighborhood. They were just places where people lived, and then they would leave the neighborhood to go wherever they did, but they didn't necessarily interact with any of the other parts of the neighborhood. And so that's a good thing for Tacoma to think about more generally, because then that neighborhood led an effort to have the entire neighborhood downzoned, which is the opposite of what we're trying to, what the city's trying to navigate here with the missing middle, to have some degree of upzoning to navigate where people can live. But if it's not designed well, the end result might be the exact opposite of what we're shooting for. So design is a really important thing that maybe people don't think about all the time, and all the aspects of it, but I think it does matter a lot to people's lived experience.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. I think that description you gave for all the components of design was really helpful for me to understand what folks are talking about when they say design, as opposed to just, what it looks like or what the facade looks like. So that was really helpful. And I heard you talk about design and scale. And scale is the word that I think planners use when they talk about differences in height and structure size. So again, looking forward to diving a little deeper into that in our future questions. Leslie, I want to give you a chance to answer this same question. What would you say are the important issues that we consider as we think about how to get missing middle housing right in Tacoma?
Hi. So I think that what I see from my perspective as a realtor and a resident, it would be that the affordability issue is at the top, because I see very concrete results of the market changing. And then related to that, I would say displacement, because we're already seeing a lot of displacement in terms of people who are renting. And when people are when a city is considering a lot of infill, we know that a portion of it will be tenants. Some of the infill being built will be investors building for tenants. Some of it will be for people to purchase. And so I think there's a balance really needed in terms of types of housing, the variety of types of housing, the consideration for displacement that's already occurring, and how that has occurred in other cities who are having growth, such as Seattle. And then just sort of the repercussions of that, right? Like the what's being developed in different neighborhoods also in Tacoma needs to be equitable. So what's right for one neighborhood may be completely wrong for a different neighborhood. So I think it really shows us that even though this is more of a form-based zoning change, and we're looking at scalability, scale of buildings, we have to look at the city as individual just that the neighborhoods really vary significantly, and we have to look at the demographics of the economic demographics, what people can afford, where people want to live, etc.
Thanks, Leslie. Yeah, and that, that mirrors what we saw in the survey at the beginning. Is folks said that one of their biggest concerns was displacement, and how this either addresses it or exacerbates it. So I know people want to hear more about that as well. So we just had a chance to talk about what the big issues are, and you all outlined some of those things: climate change, sustainability, walkability, design, scale, displacement. Those were some of the things that I heard in your answers in the first question. So, at the beginning, we talked about the fact that Tacoma is growing. That is a fact about Tacoma's growth right now. And you all brought up these really important points about issues that we need to think about as we think about getting it right. So I want to ask the question to the three of you: what is the right balance? How do we accommodate change and make neighborhoods better for everyone, knowing that there's the reality of growth, but there's also all of these issues that you all have brought up that need to be considered? And Kyle, I'd like to actually start with you this time. What do you think the right balance is?
So I think there's a couple different things that we could do to get to the point where there is some balance. And so as we head into this kind of growth, it feels good for the people living here, but also feels like it could accommodate people who are coming. And so and I just want to quote Lauren Flemister, who was a guest on the previous show here, which if you haven't seen, you should watch that. But she called it the missing middle ground, which is a great line to think about, right? You're trying to figure out how you can accommodate, but also how you can because people have invested a lot in the city, and you want those people's dreams to be honored as well. So there's a couple things to think about. One is, initially in the pilot program for the infill, there was projects were separated. So there was a project, and then 1,000 feet away, you have another project, and 1,000. So there was so you didn't end up having clumping of too many projects all in one spot. One of the reasons that was the case, because they were, I believe anyways, because then you could see how that integrated with the neighborhood. So you wouldn't have too many things happen in one spot, because then that might, again, tear at the fabric of how the neighborhood is. If they're spread out, then maybe you can see, oh, that one integrates nicely to this neighborhood, so we can do more structures that look like this, or fit like this, or are designed like this. And then it allows more of that to happen. But if too many things happen, you can't pull them back. Once they're there, they're there. So that's one thing to think about. And then other things that are out there too are like, how do we get a point where we incentivize owner-occupied stuff? We have a way, because then you end up having builders who are living there and actually want to make those developments nice, because they live there too. It's their neighborhood. So how do we incentivize maybe local people being the developers who make those things because they live there? They've thrown down stakes and they want the neighborhood to be better. So I don't know how that incentivizing tool would work, but maybe that's there. And then another one, and maybe this goes back to what Katie was mentioning earlier. I don't know how we would necessarily do this either, but how do we get housing support to people who work here? Right. So then the idea is that people who work here can live here, because really that's what we want. We have too many people. There's a huge percentage of people leave the county to go to work. And we'd really prefer that not be the case. But if we can incentivize people who own places and then work here also, it's better for our commuting. So it's better for the environment that way. But also it's just, you have more time to spend in the community as well. So those are things that would be great if we looked at. There's, the other piece of it is trying to maybe, relieve some of the pressure by, encouraging some of the development MUCs, which is what we built them for, to try to accommodate some of that growth. So if we have a few buildings going up in Proctor, if we had a few buildings going up in every MUC, how does that help, navigate some of the need as well. So there's not as much pressure sometimes in the outlying neighborhoods.
Thanks, Kyle. That's a really good perspective. Leslie, I want to jump to you and ask you the same thing. What do you think is the right balance, and how do we strike that balance?
So I think the right balance really involves understanding the needs of our current residents first, because we already live here. And there are a number of issues that the residents of Tacoma already have with housing types, with, again, displacement, with neighborhood change occurring already. And so I think that we have to balance those needs, the needs of the current residents, with people who want to move here and are moving here. And we have a lot of established building stock, historic building stock in the city that is unused and that could be used for housing. So I think that the balance that we strike is it's really hard for a lot of cities, right? It's redeveloping old buildings versus building new. And of course, it does make sense to locate them in mixed use centers. For example, in the Lincoln District, we have 2 very large buildings, and actually more, that are 2-story buildings, and they were originally multifamily. These buildings due to fire, the 2 that I'm thinking of, the buildings due to fire, have been unoccupied. And that's a lot of square footage. So I think doing an inventory of what we have already before, and I think controlling sort of that, the pace, like Kyle was saying, looking at new development and where it goes, and being able to really just balance the need for new buildings versus using what we have, because we have a lot that we can use. And yeah, I don't think I have anything else on that.
No, that's great. That's great. Thank you, Leslie. Katie, what's your perspective on this? What do you think we need to do to strike the right balance?
Well, I think that we can look at balance in a way of what are we gaining from these new neighbors and these new homes that are coming into and sort of lifting our neighborhood up, really. So even though change, feels scary, or construction in your neighborhood might feel annoying, there are tons of benefits that neighborhoods who welcome missing middle home types will experience. And I think those will soon outweigh these perceived drawbacks. So, I mean, you have increased safety in the neighborhood. More people are just out and about walking around. They're on their porches, they're in their windows, more lights are on in homes. More windows are facing the street and giving this the presence of, people looking out for each other. There's improved physical and mental health. There's better air quality if we can walk more places and ride our bikes more places. You get more fit from getting that exercise. You get friendships and connections with new neighbors. So it's more convenient when you can live close to your errands and your doctor and the market and work and school. You have more time in your day. Just like Kyle was saying, you have more time to spend in your neighborhood, and that really builds community. Lots of opportunity comes along with all this stuff, like better health and having more time. I think Kyle was mentioning this, and Lauren was mentioning this too in a previous talk. I think it's a really good point that the economics of missing middle, which I have some experience with developing some projects here in Tacoma, it really means that no one's going to be tearing down a home to build another small home or a couple of small homes. It doesn't make financial sense. So it's very unlikely that a viable existing home will be removed to build something new. And another good point was that it's more likely to be people from the community who may have been here for a long time, may have inherited property from a family member. We have clients coming to us with these exact scenarios where they want to help Tacoma's housing supply. And so I think it's a great idea to be able to sort of grassroots or home grow the developers for these missing middle housing types. So maybe even someone listening today will step up. I think it's, we have the power. If you want to have a say in how your neighborhood is shaped or changed, I would just say get in the game if you can. I know it takes a lot of resources, but if you can, I think that's how you do it.
Thanks, Katie. You guys are bringing up so many good points, and I'm seeing questions already start to come in. So I think I'm gonna ask our final question and invite you guys to say any last thing that you want to. So I'm going to combine our last two questions so that we can have a little bit more time for Q&A with our audience. So what do we need? You guys have already been talking about this for a little bit. What do we need specifically to get right for growth at a neighborhood scale? Leslie, you were talking about redevelopment of existing structures. Katie, you were talking about the things that aren't just about the housing, but what's around the housing and what kind of access and lifestyle that development leads to. Kyle, I heard you talk about livability in terms of scale and function as well. So I want to ask you all, what do we need to get right for that growth at a neighborhood scale? And then if there's anything else that you want to add as kind of what you think Tacoma's priorities should be in revisiting its housing growth vision, I'd like us to end there, and then we'll switch over to Q&A if that's all right with you all. And Kyle, I think I'm gonna start with you on this question. So what do you think the answer to that is in terms of what we need to get right for growth at a neighborhood scale?
Well, again, I do want to emphasize the design, but one of the ways that you could go about trying to navigate some of that is setting up a system where when developments are being planned in neighborhoods, and it could be large developments that are in the mixed use centers, but also maybe these missing middle things. Can we have a system where the people who are going to be building these projects meet with the neighbors around and say, hey, what does this neighborhood really want? We're putting this project in, and maybe the non-negotiable is there's going to be 4 units or 6 units in this project or whatever it's going to be, and then you start engaging the neighbors. So then the neighbors actually also, even though they're not involved in the project, they have a stake in what's going in and are actually excited about what's being added to their neighborhood. So they feel like there's going to be some addition rather than a subtraction. And that and maybe that's just something the city can do, where they have just this requirement where developers of maybe like a size more than just a couple units, they just meet with neighbors within some certain thing. And they do it early enough in the project. So if something comes up, it's not like there can't be because obviously if you're too far along in the project, then you can't change it. It costs too much. But if it's early enough, then it's actually just nice. So that's something that I think would be great. And then one of the other things that has come up at different places here, I think the transit issue is an important one to pay attention to. Part of the reason there's single family zoning so many places, that's sort of like this American dream. You have your own house and your picket fence and things like that, right? So people like single family zoning, whether they actually like it as a nostalgic kind of thing or like it just because they like it now. Because it's just what they know. And I don't know the answer to that, but it's hard to have, I think, density everywhere. Because we don't have services everywhere. There's huge swaths of the city that are not well served by transit. So if you have density everywhere, you end up having to have cars everywhere, which sort of defeats the idea of building, complete streets and neighborhood centers and things like that. You want to try to force some density into areas where there's actually robust transit, so you can reduce the number of cars that people might actually need. So it's important to kind of pay attention to some of those kinds of ideas as well when we're talking about, building in the slow changes that ultimately can make neighborhoods much better.
Thanks, Kyle. Leslie, what do you think we need to get right for growth at a neighborhood scale?
I think it depends on the neighborhood. So I think what that means is the growth has to be equitable and inclusive. So for instance, we were talking about current residents being able to build on their property or develop, or as Katie was saying, jump in. That needs to be affordable for people. There are a lot of people who, well, especially right now, we don't really use, I guess, this year as a measurement or last year, but in general, people are, if they have a viable way to bring in extra income on their property or to increase what the number of people who can live there, they're going to do that. But if they can't afford to jump in, then that's fundamentally, it's difficult for people who are less affluent to jump in, right? And so I think incentivizing that, incentives from the city, grants, loans, et cetera, things that make it possible for people to do things like that, that creates balance in the less affluent neighborhoods. And I think balancing where the development goes, I don't know how that would work, but I feel like, I guess the example I would use is when the city decided to look at doing street resurfacing. I was on a committee many years ago. We looked at how would we make this an equitable project? How would we get different neighborhoods to have new streets that needed it and not just focus on one area of the city? So that's just one example. Creating that balance in different parts of the city is really, really, it's imperative. And I think because lower income neighborhoods are targets for greedy developers. And I'm kind of like, I have a love-hate relationship with developers. So I work with them sometimes. I have friends who are developers. I know people who do all types of development, but I also don't like what goes in a lot of places, right? In this city and other cities. And so I think that as much as regulations can create more gridlock and problems, I think that a new zoning code looks at those issues.
Thanks, Leslie. Katie, I want you to close us out on this question before we shift over to Q&A. Is there anything that you would call out in terms of what we need to do to get growth right at a neighborhood scale? And you may need to take yourself off mute again, Katie.
Thanks. Yeah, I think, the neighborhood scale is often referred to as the urban fabric. And I think we can also extend that analogy to think of a neighborhood like a quilt. So what makes a quilt beautiful is the mix of colors and shapes and sizes of the pieces that are stitched together. And a beautiful neighborhood can be made out of similarly a mix of vintages and styles and materials and sizes of homes. And so when it comes to aesthetics, I think trying to please everyone can actually result in something that is loved by no one. And when a building is unloved is really when it becomes ugly because it's uncared for over time. So I think what we need to get right is having our design guidelines and capital improvements to support them emphasize building shapes that are energy efficient, and building orientation and window placement that brings in natural light and fresh air to the new and the existing neighboring homes. Durable materials, native vegetation and street trees, visual and physical connections to sidewalk and street, and just making walking, biking, and transit safe and convenient. So I think that's it.
Thanks, Katie. So I really appreciate all that you all shared. There's so much to think on from your comments, and I think the three of you gave us a really interesting, diverse set of perspectives to think about as we talk about getting housing growth right in Tacoma. I want to take this opportunity to pass it to Kenny now. And Kenny, are we ready to pose a couple of questions to our panel?
We are. Most of our questions are directed right at the city, so I'm going to kind of force Jacques to answer them so the rest of y'all don't have to speak on our behalf. But please jump in if you have any additional thoughts. Would love that. We're going to try to get through. We have 5 questions. Let's see if we can do all 5. We might not get to them, but let's see. All right. Our first one is getting asked because they've come to 2 of my events this week and I showed preferential treatment. This first one is from Kevin. I don't really do that, by the way. Just Kevin had a great question. Kevin says, I'm concerned about the need for affordable housing being lost in this discussion. Increasing property values are great for those of us who own a home, but exacerbate the difficulty of having enough stable housing for all income levels. What step will the city of Tacoma take to make sure stable housing options are available for all residents?
That is a great question. And I would amend that question by saying what steps, plural, because there is no one step to ensure affordable housing right now. So, if you tuned into the housing crisis discussion, the first discussion, I used an analogy of musical chairs, that we just don't have enough chairs for the number of people that are in the game right now. And so on one level, there is a need for just more supply. We just don't have enough housing for the people that are here and that want to be here. So one of the things that we need to do is find ways to increase our housing supply. And some of those might be development of mixed-use centers, but another strategy is exactly what we're talking about, which is allowing missing middle housing in neighborhoods to increase that supply. So that's one big thing. Another step that needs to be taken is using every partnership, incentive that we have to think about how do we increase the number of affordable units? Because having more supply without more affordable supply is going to do exactly what Kevin said, which is not necessarily lead to more affordable units that people can stay in Tacoma and live here. So those incentives include things like inclusionary zoning, impact fees. There's a bunch of different strategies that we can take to make sure that there are more affordable units. But to actually answer, I would point people to our action strategy, which is at cityoftacoma.org/AHAS. And there's actually 24 different actions that we have in that are really aimed at building enough support to have more affordable housing options. Everything from how we use surplus property to how we support people that are experiencing a housing crisis. And yeah, I'll leave it at that, but great question.
Jacques, you broke up at the most important part when you were saying you can look up the City of Tacoma's Affordable Housing Action Strategy. And I'm really glad how you answered that question, because you answered someone else's question who was wondering if we had considered inclusionary zoning, to which I hear you saying yes. I hear that Katie has a comment and then Kyle wants to jump in too.
Yeah, I also wanted to add that we need to think of livability and housing affordability as really including other costs, such as our health care, or if we're leading a healthy lifestyle, we spend less on our medical expenses. If we don't need to own a car because we live in a walkable neighborhood and live close to where we need to go, that's like a savings of $10,000 a year, like at the minimum. So I think we really need to think about affordability as a holistic thing.
That was a great comment there, right, Katie, and actually leads a little bit into what I was going to say too. There, in a previous conversation, there were comments about building community trusts community land trusts that can help navigate costs of housing. But again, also a piece of that could be how we prioritize people who actually work here. So we're supporting the people who want to live here and want to work here, because that's what's going to make our city function best, when people are not just constantly driving to other parts of the state to do their jobs. So that's an important thing to think about for affordability. We want the people who are working here, we want them to be able to live here.
Thanks, y'all. Next question is from Dolly. We'll start with Jacques, but I have a feeling others will have thoughts. We hear concerns about adequate off-street and on-street parking, privacy, safety, and noise when discussing infill housing. Can these concerns be addressed more directly in this conversation?
Great question, Dolly. And I think, hi, Dolly. There is a lot there to unpack. And Kyle, I think, was trying to tease out a lot of those when he talked about design, right at the very beginning of our conversation, in how we design parking, how we design the structures themselves, how they sit next to the other structures in the neighborhood. And I think all of those are absolutely concerns that we have to take into account, right? So in no way are we trying to sweep those valid concerns about what infill will look like under the rug. In fact, we want this process to actually help figure out what the community wants out of those design standards, right? And Leslie, I'm gonna turn back to something that you said, which is that there's no one right answer to that, because neighborhoods are very different, right? So what might work for one neighborhood in terms of on-street or off-street parking may not work in another neighborhood. And similarly, what might work in terms of design for scale in fitting next to the other units in that neighborhood, again, wouldn't work in that neighborhood. So Dolly, I just want to say those are all really important design features that you point out that are being considered as part of this conversation. And before I pass it to you, Kyle, I see you wanting to add something, and Leslie, you as well. I would just say that the next step is to think about this at the neighborhood level, right? Like Kyle was saying, how do we engage with the neighborhood in an effective way where we allow the people in that neighborhood to have a say and to be bought into what some of those design features might look like? Leslie, and then Kyle.
Thanks. Yeah, I think what popped into my head right away talking about cars and parking is that in Tacoma, we're a very car-focused city, unfortunately. I mean, I think that's to our detriment. We could take that conversation all the way down to what value does the pedestrian have? And it made me think of Jane Jacobs. If you don't know who Jane Jacobs is, find out, read some of her writing. She, just to encapsulate her writings and her discoveries were from being a resident in her own neighborhood and looking at sort of the street. I think she called it the ballet or the dance of the street, right? Like what activity occurs on streets, on sidewalks. And so I think when it comes to cars, yes, parking is something important, but when you look at older countries, older cities, and you see that cars are not the focus of a city, you tend to see a more vibrant city. And we actually have so much space here. We have a lot of parking lots. We have a lot of impermeable surfaces. And so I get that there are always arguments about, I don't have enough parking on my street. I don't have enough parking on my lot. There are issues with that, but those issues aren't necessarily going to be solved in the same ways that we've solved them in the past. And when you look at our zoning code, it was really developed around the era of the car. It was designed around automobile use. And so I think there are a lot of different ways to look at not only car use, but parking. So that's what I have on that.
Can I just jump in? Okay. That was great, Leslie. That was really well said. I do want to just add too that like one of the things that could be worked through, and maybe this is part of the process of it going forward, is that if there are concerns about how these projects are going into the neighborhoods, I mean, maybe that's just part of how some of these zoning ideas roll out, that they roll out and maybe there's separations between projects, so they're not all clustered necessarily in one particular place. But then maybe after a year, after you see some of the projects that are rolled out, you go back and look and say, is this what we want, or is this not what we want? And then you can make changes, but then you haven't gone wholesale into one thing or another. So then you can actually revisit and say, no, this has really been a problem. Look at this, and this. And then you say, okay, well then let's just fix those things and then change it and move on. And then maybe even at that point, it's easier to look at what's going to work more specifically for neighborhoods, because you can see some examples of what's gone in. It's really hard for people to get their heads around what can be there if they've never lived next to something like this before. They just don't necessarily have a sense of how it's going to work with the neighborhood, or how it's going to add to the neighborhood.
Thanks, everybody. We have time for one more question, but you're all reminding me how lucky I am to have an affordable apartment right on this magic bus line, the 11, which goes from my apartment in the North End to my work downtown to where I volunteer in Lincoln. Not many buses do that though, right? That have that much accessibility in our town. And I'm extremely privileged to have such an affordable apartment, which means I haven't driven a car in 5 years, and I think a lot of Tacomans would love a life like that. A life like mine is what I'm saying. I have such a great life. But enough about my life. Last question, and this is a really important one, Jacques. So we might go 2 minutes over. I hope that's okay. Mary asks, well, first Mary says, I'm new to this conversation, but then Mary asks, I've always wondered how one prevents displacement without some form of rent control. Is that a part of this conversation, Jacques? And folks?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll defer to Leslie in particular, because I know this is something that she thinks about a lot. But again, there's no one solution to preventing displacement, because displacement happens for a number of different reasons. So as we think about missing middle housing, it can be an anti-displacement strategy. So just think about the homeowner who is able to put an ADU on their lot and have rental income that allows them to accommodate rising property taxes, or the rent that they're no longer able to afford because they're on disability or Social Security or any other kind of limited income. So that's one thing. The other thing is displacement can happen because of loss of income. We've seen this year just how much economic turmoil something like a pandemic can have. And so issues around, rental assistance and support can be a potential avenue to helping. Another avenue is thinking about how do we help people own their own homes, right? So thinking about helping people who are asset limited afford a down payment to stay in the neighborhood that they have lived in for a while as an ownership opportunity, which sometimes can be less than rent, is another option. So there's a lot of strategies or tactics that we can take to try to limit or disrupt displacement patterns that are happening. And missing middle zoning can help in that, depending on how we do it. So panelists, please jump in if you have any additions to that.
Actually, don't jump in. Jacques, I think we can fit our very last question, and then we will have gotten to all of them. Sorry, Leslie.
No.
This person wants to ask, what about restricting or prohibiting speculation by investment funds and individuals through regulation, vacancy, and speculation taxes, as well as requiring all larger landlords to have a minimum % of affordable rentals and all developers to offer a minimum % of affordable housing? Can we speak to that? And Leslie, still jump in with your thought after this.
Yeah, I'll be very quick on this one. A lot of those things that were brought up are state level policies. And so the city has some levers that we can pull, but a lot of those that were just mentioned, we actually don't have control of because they're regulated at the state level. For the ones that you did talk about that are at the local level, I would just quickly point you to the Affordable Housing Action Strategy again to see if those kind of match up with what you're thinking. And if not, please contact us at the city so that we can talk more about it.
Leslie, did you have your thoughts you want to share?
I have so many on that, so I'll try to keep it brief. As far as the rent control issue, I think we see this in really big cities like New York, but we're not New York, right? So I think rent control in cities has to be approached with a true understanding of what that city is, what the demographics are, what the finances look like, who is unable to afford rent, who is being displaced currently, what are the rents, what do the numbers look like, what does the data show us? And I think it also, on the flip side of that, for tenants, it means education about leasing. You know, how do you protect yourself as a tenant from being displaced? How do and so I think that whole conversation is, it's a separate conversation about affordability in general. And then in terms of sorry, Kenny, will you remind me again of the second question, because there was something I wanted to comment specifically on that.
Oh, I lost it. Let me find it. It was about restricting or prohibiting speculation by investment funds.
Yes. Okay. So as far as policy, it's really important that if you care about housing policy, that you get involved at the state level. When there are laws being made and changed, contact your representatives, understand what they're doing as far as housing policy, encourage them, tell them what your specific problem is in your city. And that doesn't mean that cities aren't caving to the needs and desires of developers. But I think that's just, again, it's a balance between residents, current residents, people who are investors, and people who want to move here. And so that's a huge, policy is a really big part of this, because it's what governs all of it, right? I mean, what's allowed and what isn't allowed, that's under the law. So yes, and I would definitely refer to the affordability action strategy, because it's something that the city staff and a lot of people have put a lot of time and energy into, and it's pretty detailed. And I think definitely provide your feedback and encourage your neighbors, encourage your friends to get involved and comment and really try to understand where the city would like to take us for our benefit.
Thanks, Leslie. This is the first time we've ever gone over, and I think it's because this conversation is so good. And since we're already late, why not just be a little bit later? I want to give Katie and Kyle an opportunity to give closing thoughts. I feel like Leslie got to wrap up with some amazing thoughts. Although Leslie, if you want to jump in again, what's stopping us? Zoom is free. Actually, Zoom is really expensive, but we've already paid for it. Kyle, will you share some closing thoughts if you can do it in like 90 seconds, and then Katie?
Sure. I think I don't need 90 seconds. Hey, I just want to say thanks again for hosting this stuff. And Leslie and Katie, it was a pleasure to be on the panel with you. I think for me, again, it just goes back to like figuring out a way to, I mean, we want to plan this. I know we're talking about planning, but we want to plan this, right? We want to plan it in a way that we actually build something where the fabric of the neighborhood is improved for people who are coming here, for people who are already here, and improved in a number of ways that Katie listed that she was talking about, but improved in a number of ways that Leslie was saying too, where you think about the different kinds of people who are trying to get things out of a neighborhood. And how do you ultimately achieve that? And that's really hard, because it's hard to get that balance. But I think you ultimately can get there a little bit more securely if you're looking at some of the design elements that make neighborhoods work together. The people who are living there work together because of the built infrastructure that's around them.
Thanks, Kyle. Katie, what are you thinking as we close?
Yeah, ditto for all the thank yous. And I think just really focusing on how there's so much synergy between sustainable development, sustainable growth, putting more density into all of our neighborhoods, the gentle density that missing middle housing will add to our existing established neighborhoods, and help lift up neighborhoods that don't have as many resources right now. And kind of if you build it, it will come idea that once we get that critical mass of people to support businesses, and that brings jobs or transit or any number of other benefits, and just really focusing on the positive and upside of I call it the untapped potential of the missing middle.
I love that, Katie. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to let Jacques say goodbye, but thank you, everyone, for coming. And especially thank you if you stayed late. If you need a note for your teacher, please email me and I'll get one from my boss or something. All right, Jacques, can you say goodbye to everybody?
Yes, thank you so much, Kenny. And before we say goodbye, a huge thank you, Leslie, Kyle, Katie, thank you so much for joining us today and having this fantastic conversation. As you can tell, we tried to cover 5 hours worth of content in 1 hour, and I think the three of you did beautifully in that regard. But there's so much to talk about, so we want to keep the conversation going. If you have more to say, again, would like to invite you to the Home in Tacoma website on the City of Tacoma's page to take the Housing Choice Survey and tell us more, and get involved as we move forward in the process. And you'll see more on that webpage about how you can get involved as we move forward with the Planning Commission, the City Council, and all of the decisions that will be coming forth, and this conversation continues. But we learned a lot today. I'll speak for myself. I learned a lot today from the three of you about how to get housing growth right in Tacoma and the missing middle. So thank you so much. And to all of our attendees, have a great rest of your Friday and have a great weekend.